Now on BBC World News, Linda Yu speaks to the rock star central banker credited with bringing India back from the economic brink. This week's Talking Business.
India has had to take some deep breaths this summer. Investors were leaving. The rupee hit an all-time low. But has one man brought India back from the brink? The new central bank governor Raghuram Rajan gives us his first international broadcast interview and tells us why India will not seek aid and what he thinks about being called a rock star. Welcome to Talking Business with me, Linda Yu, from Mumbai. Governor Rajan, thank you so much for speaking to the BBC. It's a real pleasure to be here in Mumbai. First off, I just wanted to start off by asking, what does it feel like to be called a rock star central banker?
Well, I try not to think about it because inevitably people will come to terms with the fact that central bankers are boring, conservative people. So that'll be the fall, but while it lasts, let them talk about it.
I bet your wife really likes it.
I don't know whether she likes it or she's worried, but she has me nicely tethered, so.
I want to ask you a little bit about the Rajan rally that you've caused. The stock markets are up, the rupee has regained some of the lost ground. How long is this rally going to last?
Well, seriously, I mean, what we have been trying to do, both the government and the Reserve Bank, is try to change the perception about India. Mm-hmm. We've clearly been helped by favorable external circumstances. The fact that the Fed decided not to taper, the fact that Syria didn't plunge into an all-out problem with bombardment by the US. And of course, unfortunately, the fact that the U.S. With its fiscal contretemps has, perhaps postponed tapering even further. We've also done a fair amount internally to try and change the perception that India is a country with severe macroeconomic problems I think there was a point at which people thought even the unimaginable, India, a country with $280 billion in reserves, would find it difficult to finance its current account deficit. That was never a possibility, but people weren't willing to go beyond the headlines. And the headlines, I have to say, the newspapers in bad times tend to pick out every bad thing that's happening and focus on it. And that tends to make things even worse. So our attempt was to try and change the dialogue. We do have macroeconomic challenges. We have high inflation. We have a fiscal deficit which is much too large, and we've been bringing it down, but we need to do more. And we had an external deficit. We were financing ourselves from the rest of the world, again much too large. Now, we have focused on bringing down that borrowing, and I'm happy to report that while the governments and the RBI, the Reserve Bank, says that we'll be borrowing 3.7 percentage points of GDP this year, down from 5 last year, the private analysts think it could be much better than that, much lower. So we're happy with that change. We can certainly finance it many times over with the money we have, but we need to create a better mood for investors. And from our perspective at the Reserve Bank, the best way to do that is A, give people a sense we're going to control inflation. Inflation is 9% if you look at consumer price indices, much lower when you look at wholesale prices, something like 2% when you look at non-food manufacturing. But we do need to bring down the consumer price inflation. And the second thing is we need to give people a sense that we're focused on creating the structural reforms needed for growth, and that we've been emphasizing. We're going to change the financial sector in India over the next 5 years, make it much stronger, much more resilient, and
is that
much
sort
more
of your
welcoming.
time frame for your 5 pillars? These are your aspirations and reform goals.
Absolutely. So 5 pillars: fix the monetary framework, fix the banking structure, make it more competitive, more entry, deepen the markets, reach every Indian, whether they're in remote villages or whether they're running a small or medium enterprise. So bring more people into the system. And finally, the 5th pillar is have better systems to deal with distress, whether it's corporate distress or bank distress. But 5 years is a reasonable horizon. And that's why I say 5.
I want to come back a little bit to the value of the rupee, because obviously that affects inflation. The weaker the rupee, the more expensive imports are going to be. And different central bankers around the world have begun to look at, obviously, the currency. For instance, the Bank of England and others say, well, actually, that looks about right. Do you think that there is a level of the rupee that you're comfortable with, say where it's at now, which is approaching 60 to the US dollar?
No, I try not to say this is the appropriate value of the rupee. I do know when it has gone too far. 68, which is what it reached in the end of August, was to my mind a little too far relative to our fundamentals. I would think at this point 50 is probably too strong relative to our fundamentals. But there's a fair gap in between, a fair range in between where I'm comfortable that Indian exports are competitive and we will generate enough through those exports to pay for our large imports. But the real issue is not just the current level, but to give investors, domestic and foreign, a sense that the value of the rupee will retain, that the rupee will retain its value. And for that, the key is to bring down inflation so that people don't think that we need a steady depreciation in order to preserve competitiveness, that the rupee will not weaken.
You're doing a lot. It sounds like you're doing a lot, but there's a limit to what central bankers can do. So I'm going to make you identify some of your limits.
Right.
One is, would you be able to prevent a currency or financial crisis as a central banker?
Of course, that we can. What we can't do, well, so one of the things that developing country central bankers have, that developed country central bankers don't have, is we have the ability to generate a fair amount of growth through structural reforms. If I can bring credit to a village which doesn't have credit, a whole new set of businesses get set up. I don't have to change interest rates, I don't have to do anything else, but just let them have access to credit. That makes a world of difference. So, the structural reforms that we do can enhance growth, considerably. We don't have to deploy unconventional monetary policies to get that. However, there are limits, as you correctly point out, to how much, finance is always an enabling device. You need real entrepreneurship, real businesses to be set up, real roads to be built. Those have much bigger, much greater effect. And that requires governance, implementation, and those are things the government has to do. But in India, one of the things that a lot of people miss out is they focus on just the central government. We have a large number of states. It's like Europe. We have states which have populations which are bigger than most countries in Europe. In fact, Uttar Pradesh has more people than any country in Europe. But the point is, each of these states has an independent government which can do a lot. And different states have been moving, enhancing the investment climate in their state. So don't, for the foreign investor, don't think of India as one piece. Try it out and you will see that there's a piece that fits you. And I think this is what increasingly investors across the world are seeing. They're seeing governments that are friendly towards their aspirations. If you think of India as a power-short country, there are states which have excess power, which are looking to have industries that can use that power. If you think it's hard to acquire land, well, there are states that have fixed the land acquisition problem, where you can buy land from the state and set up enterprises. So for every problem, there's a state which has solved it. And so to that extent, I think it's worth looking finer into India and see what you can do.
In your mind, I mean, what is actually, I'd like to get your take on what the biggest impediments to something which I think is fairly fundamental, which is industrialization.
Yes.
For India. Obviously, access to finance is part of it, and that's within one of your pillars. But I suppose for many, they would say the other big side of that, it would be education, human capital.
Right.
Still a country with substantial amounts of poverty.
Right.
It's a bit of a conundrum as to why it is India hasn't industrialized and kind of, grown quickly. What do you think is really holding it back?
Well, first, when you say industrialized, I presume you mean the manufacturing sector, which is smaller than other emerging markets.
Yeah.
Our service sector is much, much larger than the typical emerging market at our level of development.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the combination, what that leaves out is the number of people in agriculture and closely associated people in rural areas.
Yeah.
We're about where China was at our level of GDP, except that China had more people in manufacturing, fewer in services, and we have the reverse. Now, it does lead to the legitimate question: why do we have so few workers in manufacturing? And I would say there are, four reasons. One, infrastructure. We haven't built out infrastructure in the way China has. And there are certain reasons, including the fact that land acquisition is tougher in a democracy, where we have to pay attention to the people whose land is being acquired. Not saying that China is not, but it's easier in some ways to do it there. Second is our education, which you correctly point out. People think India is over-endowed with educated people, perhaps in some areas, but we still, despite the large number of engineers we graduate, not all of them are of top quality. We need an improvement in quality, and we need more people in certain areas. We need more construction engineers, for example. We need more plumbers. We need more electricians. So we need to improve the quality of human capital and train it more to the jobs that are available. And to that extent, we are similar to many other countries that are looking for a revolution in human capital. We have some programs underway, but we probably need more. The third is business regulation. Yes, the stories about Indian bureaucracy, there's a reason for those stories. We're trying to improve, and as I said, competition between states is bringing down the level of over-regulation in some areas. But we have to find our way in some others. For example, environmental regulation. How do we make it effective? That is, not stop industry cold, but at the same time have the effect of protecting the environment that we want to protect. So those are three important, and the fourth is finance, which we've already talked about. But I think if we work, and we are working all four, take infrastructure. The image of infrastructure is creaky airports, but now if you come into Delhi, you'll see a world-class airport. If you come into Bombay after December, you will see a world-class airport again. State-of-the-art, fantastic new airports. Probably in the next 4 years, if you travel between Delhi and Bombay, you will be traveling through the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, where we hope to have high-speed roadways, high-speed rail links, 8, 9 new cities, and a tremendous high-quality infrastructure built up around, with the scope for new firms opening up there with lighter regulation.
I guess, Governor, one of the things listening to you is these are all things which sound extremely, reform-oriented to get India's growth rate up again. But what would you say to those foreign investors who say, well, Governor Rajan, I think you are on the right track, you've inspired some confidence, but what you're describing is not something which you can make happen. This is going to have to come from the government. It's going to have to come from other parts of it.
Well, as I said,
should you be Prime Minister Rajan?
No,
Maybe that's the answer.
I think we have a very, very good Prime Minister, and the point, however, is that India is a large country. If I want to look for the bad, there's plenty of bad I can find. but people ignore the good in times like this. And there are good people across government. As I said, the rock star will wear off here, but there are rock stars everywhere else. And the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor is run by a very competent bureaucrat, Amitabh Kant.
Focusing on my current rock star, one of the concerns with the raising of interest rates that you've done in the 2 months that you're in office is that you're trying to control inflation, but it is hurting growth. And when I've talked to people around Mumbai, they're very concerned about the prices of goods, and I can see why it is that you've done that. But looking ahead, do you think this is the right trade-off, given how growth is the slowest in a decade and generating some of the worries of a crisis?
Well, these are, first, I don't think there's any worry of a crisis. Second, these are the consequences of some of the challenges we are facing up to. Typically, you have high inflation when you have high growth, so it's a no-brainer. Let me raise interest rates, slow down growth a little bit. What we have now is slowing growth because of some of the constraints to setting up factories, setting up firms that have emanated over the last few years, and that's caused what economists call supply-side constraints. We're not producing as much as we should, even while demand is high. And perhaps this is most felt in agriculture, where despite fairly strong growth of products that people want, such as milk, poultry and so on, you're still seeing relatively high price growth because it's not keeping pace with the increased demand. In a sense, that's a disease of riches. As people are getting richer, they're changing their consumption patterns, and we need to produce more of the stuff that they want, but it's taking time to do that. So, two answers. One, constrain demand a little bit, which is what we have to do to get inflation back under control. But the other is increase supply. And as far as demand goes, we need to move demand more from consumption to investment. And that is our challenge. How do you get more investment even while consumption demand is slowing? And we have to muddle through, in a sense, and muddling through has unfortunately, in these environments where you have slowing growth but also high inflation, we don't have a clear, easy answer. You can't compress growth too much, because then you won't get the investment that you want to fix the supply side problems. But if you have too high growth, then you have the high inflation, which will again come back to hit you. So it's muddling through.
No, it is. And you said there's no chance of crisis. When we spoke last year, we talked about how some of the traits that India had was reminiscent of what happened in 1991. A very large current account deficit. It's coming down, but it's still fairly large. Fiscal deficit, as you say, coming down, but still fairly large. And of course, money leaving the country, which is one of the reasons for the fall of the rupee. Why would it be different now than in 1991, given that the rupee is actually weaker than what it was then?
Well, first, we're slowing, but we're still growing at 5%. Okay. Second, our external debt, people don't realize this, is about 22% of GDP. That's small. I mean, there are very few countries that have got into an external crisis with debt of 22% of GDP. Third, our reserves are 15% of GDP. We can pay back all the short-term debt tomorrow if they want it. So in that sense, we have plenty of reserves. And this is why when people say, are you going to go to the IMF? I say, for what? What can the IMF give me? We're actually lending money to the IMF. Whatever we get from the IMF is going to be a fraction of the 280 billion in reserves that we have.
But would it help for the IMF to have a structural program, though, to help growth? Because in the 90s, that was one of the things which
we are doing that structural program ourselves.
But would the IMF give you an external, almost an excuse to do it? In other words, overcome some of the politics by having an external force come in and say, these are the 4 things you need to do to get to industrialization.
But we have to do it ourselves.
No IMF?
It's not going to happen. I love the IMF. I worked there for a while.
You did.
I think it's a great organization. I think they give a lot of good advice. I'm happy for all the advice they will give. But going into an IMF program is to some extent a sacrifice of your sovereignty. If you can do it yourself, if you can take the medicine yourself, and we have plenty of economists to give us the advice we need. But we're happy if the IMF wants to give us additional advice, we certainly will consider it. But we have to follow our own path. And our sense is that yes, this will be affected somewhat by the politics, but that will be true of any IMF program also. As you can see in Greece, the politics do affect what the eventual outcome is. People don't just take the IMF as gospel truth and then follow through because there are political constraints. But we have a eminent economist as the Prime Minister of this country. So I don't think it's lack of economic knowledge here. What we have to do is follow through on the program we've set for ourselves.
We're out of time, but just very finally, I think one of the reasons why India has been under pressure, like other emerging economies, is because of the possibility of the Fed reining back its cheap cash. Do you think the Fed is taking enough consideration of the global impact of its actions?
I think that at every international meeting, the Fed has been hearing the concerns of the emerging markets. Now, the Fed's mandate, as many Federal Reserve presidents have said, does not include foreign countries and their growth, except indirectly to the extent it feeds back into US growth. But nevertheless, I don't think the Fed would like to see other countries experience serious difficulties. And to that extent, they are mindful. To some extent, you might even think that the shot across the bows that Bernanke fired in May was an attempt to get the markets to prepare for an eventual Fed tapering. And certainly, I think we will be better prepared when that actually happens. So I have no doubt that the Fed will be circumspect, will take the rest of the world into consideration, but of course their primary focus will be the domestic US economy.
Thank you very much, Governor, for speaking to us.
Most welcome.
It's not hard to see why India has great growth potential. It has a young English-speaking population. The world's largest democracy potentially has the best growth prospects of any major economy in the world. But persistent problems like poverty and a lack of education are why India has been brought to the brink of crisis time and again. Central Bank Governor Rajan may have brought India back from the brink this time, but he acknowledges how hard it is to support the rupee, fight inflation, and generate economic growth. But he remains convinced that he will achieve his reform aims within 5 years, one of which is to improve access to finance for Indian businesses, and that will support economic growth. But it's likely to take more than one rock star to have a lasting impact on India. That's all for this week. Join me next week for more Talking Business.